Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I welcome you to the sixth program in our special series titled Celebrating Canadian-American Friendship. We've so enjoyed this series, and we are enjoying bringing it to you in the next few weeks. Our great friends to the north hear our program, and certainly we're very happy with this topic, which was a symposium topic at North Idaho College in the spring. On today's program, we're going to deal with First Nations and newcomers' legacies of the Native American experience in Canada and the United States, and we are so fortunate to have as our guest someone highly qualified to address this topic. I welcome to the program Dr. Barton Barber. He has a PhD in history, and he is an assistant professor of history at Boise State University in Boise, Idaho. The history of North American fur traders comprises the bulk of his research and his writings. He has published a number of journal articles and is the author of Fort Union and the Upper Missouri Fur Trade. This book was a finalist for the Western Writers of American Spur Award for Best Western Nonfiction Historical category and appeared in a paperback edition in 2002. Dr. Barber, welcome to the program. It's so great to have you here, and I want to say to our audience, you took time off in your spring break to be with us, and so that's real dedication. We thank you very much.
My pleasure, thank you.
I'm very pleased to have our regular panelist, Erna Reinhardt, who's Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and she shall start today's questioning.
Good afternoon and welcome to the show. We are delighted to have you here. This has been a really educational week for all of us, and we're learning lots about Canada that we didn't know before. And your expertise is in the area of Native Americans, and I want to have you give our viewers and give us a brief little history lesson about the Native American groups that we are talking about when we're talking about maybe this region, Western Canada and Washington, Idaho, Oregon, Montana. What groups are we talking about? And give us kind of a historical perspective of those groups' history.
Well, I think in terms of what usually is described as culture areas, there are sort of three areas that impinge on our region. One would be the sort of Western Plains dwelling folks. A second group would be what we call the plateau types. These are the folks mostly in Idaho and parts of southern British Columbia. And then very famously, the coastal, usually called Northwest Coast nations, best recognized by totem poles and large canoes and cedar houses and things like that. So those are sort of the three groups that have been most important historically in this region, in the transboundary U.S.-Canada region today.
And are all of those three groups still present today?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
In fact, they're very present today, and in both nations there's been real movement towards equity and assertion from the natives of treaty rights, obligations by the respective national governments and things like that. So there's been some really important and exciting changes in the last 20, 30 years that really will have a lot to do, I think, with the 21st century.
Excellent.
Let's follow up on that whole process. We in the United States are more familiar with the treaties that this government has made with tribes across America, and also with the oftentimes breaking of those treaties. We in our country and in our classes in history, we hear far less about the relationship between the tribes in Canada and their government. Would you make a comparison, compare and contrast those two relationships as it relates to legal aspects?
In the United States, I don't know the exact number, but I'm thinking about Charles Kapler's list of treaties that he published years and years ago. There are a few hundred treaties, ranging really from the very beginning of the national era right on up to about 1870, when the federal government decided to make no more treaties, and that inaugurated a new era, a different era of how to deal between the United States and Native nations. But in the aggregate, there are a few hundred treaties, and mostly there were some multi-tribal treaties, most famously the Fort Laramie treaties of 1851 and 1868. There were a few Southern Plains analogies to those, but in many instances, the United States government made treaties with individual nations. By contrast, in Canada, because of the timing of Confederation. In other words, by the late 1860s, around 1870 is when Canada became a confederation. And so they started anew at that point. By that time, that's about the time the United States quit making treaties. So the Canadian precedent is based on a few important things, most particularly the Proclamation Line of 1763, which established a northern and southern Indian superintendency in what is today the United States, but impinged a bit on Canada. From that point on until the 1870s or 80s, because of the nature of the Hudson's Bay Company and their giant land grant, they were pretty much operating in the West with really sovereign power. Once the British North American Act was signed in 1867 or so, it laid the groundwork for the HBC, Hudson's Bay Company, to yield its ancient charter. So from that point on, the Confederation made a series of treaties. But by my count, the total number of treaties from 1870 until about 1923 is only 16 or 18. And most of those treaties dealt with huge land masses, unlike the American treaties that were generally focused on single tribal entities. But in both cases, that is the United States and Canada, the basic exchange was for certain rights and prerogatives and protections rendered to native nations in exchange for land. And in every case, it's less land for certain protections under the special relationship that Native people, First Nations, have with their respective governments.
And in relation to that, since there's one, as you indicated, so many more treaties in this country than in Canada, and the time period is different, in that relationship between the tribes and the Canadian government and the U.S. government, is one of them a system where there's more sovereignty recognized by the tribes in relation to that national government than the other country?
That is a question that no doubt has different answers, but my answer is that that if you really strip it right down, there isn't a whole lot of difference.
Okay.
The evidence to support my position is that if you look at what happens to Native people in the United States and Canada between 1870 and roughly, the 1930s or later, in both nations you have a steady decline in practical sovereignty by Native nations. And you also have a decline. Population in both nations reaches a nadir around 1920. In other words, from 1500 or 1600 until 1920 in both of the major, our North American nations, Indian population continued to decline. Conditions of life for Native people, disease, insufficient food, you name it, military power, everything is in decline in parallel. So that functionally speaking, in terms of sovereignty, irrespective of the constitutional guarantees of limited sovereignty, in both cases you'd find a real decline. What this does, among other things, is kind of feed what historians sometimes declare to be "Lo the Poor Indian" routine. This is from a poem from the late 18th century, "Lo the Poor Indian." And so the idea is that this all squares, in a sense, with the predicted disappearance of Native Americans. I mean, much of Indian policy in both Canada and the United States was predicated on the notion that the inevitable disappearance was going to happen, and therefore the whole idea was to sort of make that as easy as possible in some cases, with very little regard in either nation being paid to the actualities of Native life or in a real sense the treaty obligations that the nations, that is United States and Canada, had to maintain and live up to because they had made these sacred agreements with Native nations. So from my point of view, in both cases, that is the United States and Canada, there's a real similar trend. Sovereignty for United States Native nations was further defined, though it is mentioned in the Constitution. It was more clearly defined in the 1830s in the John Marshall Supreme Court in the Andrew Jackson era, and refined thereafter to the famous phrase of domestic dependent nations. And that may have been so, but the fact remained that they did possess a kind of sovereignty because all U.S. Indian treaties were nation-to-nation treaties, essentially, until 1870 when they stopped doing that. Now in Canada, much of the same thing happens, but the practical outcome of those treaties was the erosion of native land, the erosion of resource bases, and in neither nation did natives have civil rights, voting rights, political rights, or access to education or economic betterment or virtually anything. And so in that sense,
Very similar.
there's a real similarity. The main difference, the one difference that is easily identified is that in Canada, with the exception of the Riel Rebellion in the 1880s in Western Canada, there's almost no instance where the nation of Canada projected serious military force against Native people.
Right.
Whereas obviously in the United States that happens over and over and over again. And so what some people then conclude from looking at this is, well, the United States is far more bloody-handed and genocidal. Canada, therefore, by that comparison, looks a little bit more sterling, a little better. My argument about that is, it sounds crude to say, but I think it's true. If the United States policy was directed toward genocide, to the literal extinction of Native people, it could have been done, but it wasn't. It never was a policy. It just looks like it was. Whereas in Canada, there's very little of that, and in that sense, one could argue that Canadians had maybe felt more honor-bound to adhere to treaty provisions than the United States did. There are many reasons why this could be so, including the rapid, gigantic expansion of the United States in population, industrial development, farmstead development, western state development, the whole thing, and a huge population. I mean, the United States has approximately 10 times as many people as Canada. Mm-hmm. And so the kind of pressures that one would see in U.S. history in the West, for example, are far less evident in some respects in Canada, though it is important to remember, as I keep discovering to my surprise, 90% of the Canadian population lives within 100 miles of the United States border.
Just
so
across
that means
the border.
there's a lot of action on the
Right.
borderline. But what about all the folks that are living way north of that borderline? There's a bit of a different story there.
Right. Thank you. Erna Reinhardt.
I want to ask you a question about a topic that I think you want to talk about, so hopefully this will work out really well for both of us. We can always learn so much through history and from our history. Tell us about some of the legacies that Indians have left for us that maybe we're not very aware of.
Well, there are several, and some are really fundamentally important to world history, and others are a bit harder to grasp in a sense. So let me start with the ones that are like well known and terribly important. Where would the Italians be without tomatoes? Where would the Irish be without potatoes? Where would we all be without Chile? Cocoa, all kinds of things, dyewoods, medicinal plants, corn, beans, squash, all kinds of native foods and stuff like that have transformed the planet because they were exported in the early colonial era and really truly did transform the world. So at one level, that's going on. That's a huge contribution to world history. Then there are sort of technologies that were critically important in the development of North American history. Some of these sound kind of run-of-the-mill, but they're really, really important. Snowshoes, canoes, moccasins, just the way that natives lived on the land. Had it not been for the fact that Europeans, thanks to native assistance, learned those things, the shape of North American history would have been quite different. I mean, just as a ready example at hand and current these days, where would Lewis and Clark have been without the innumerable Indians who helped them all the way from St. Louis to the West Coast and back? I mean, the story just wouldn't be the same without Indians. So there's that kind of stuff. Some folks have said, if we think about, for example, American constitutionalism, something that's often considered to be really important in American life, and I agree that it is, it's true that the Founding Fathers were scholars of classical history, so they studied Greece and Rome, and they understood the history of republics in time past, and so on. Having said that, however, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Six Nations, who were very, very important in the colonial area. They lived in New York, and they really did hold the balance of power between the English and the French for the better part well, of a century and a half. That's pretty important in itself. But they also were Republicans, small r Republicans, and egalitarians and libertarians. All three of those things are important in American political history. And there are records that indicate that guys like Benjamin Franklin and the early historian of the Iroquois Confederacy of Pennsylvania named Cadwallader Colden did exchange letters in the 1740s and 50s having to do to some degree with their appreciation of what the Iroquois governmental structure was. Now, I'm not suggesting that the American Constitution was built solely upon an Iroquois model, but there is evidence that these founders were, some of them at least, were tuned into this and were very mindful of it. So there's that. Finally, I think the sort of most compelling legacy that strikes me with reference to modern Americans and modern life in America is, quite simply, we like to think we live in a multicultural nation. This is on everybody's lips. It's in government records, it's in museums, it's in cultural institutions, and in universities. And the question is, when you cut right down to the bone, can we or can we not accept people who are different than us? I think that if you look at Native American history, you can find so many ways of making a case out of this. For example, if we think about religious toleration, freedom of conscience, and stuff like that, we must accept Native American faith as it is and not force change upon it. The fact is that historically speaking, no mission program, none, anywhere, anytime in North America were truly effective. There are converts, that's to say the least, that's certainly true. Christianity and presumably even Judaism or whatever else may play a role in Native American life, but not one of those efforts ever truly supplanted Native faith with an alien faith. And so we must really address that, I think, or else we don't really live what we think we do. I think the same argument could be put in terms of civil rights and human rights. It's not just religious rights, it's all kinds of rights. The acceptance of somebody who's different than us as critically important in American culture and society. These, in other words, if we look at Native Americans, we confront the real guts of what we think is our civic creed. And I think that's pretty darned important. I mean, anybody in America, and I've spent quite a bit of time in Quebec, especially in Canada, but a bit in the Northwest as well, and I've encountered people who had an entirely negative attitude about the darn Indians, this and that and the other thing, and it always reminds me of the same thing, which is this idea of acceptance. And Canada, in my opinion, is functioning a little more civilly than the United States is now in a variety of ways. And I think Canada, to put it simply, has done better by Indians in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, than has the United States, though I think there's parallels to be drawn there as well. So that's why I think there's legacies here that are really, really important. They're never going to go away. The Indians never did vanish, despite all the predictions that they would, and we're stuck with them. And what we're stuck with dealing is what they mean and what we mean, and how can we cooperate in this continent to make it a better place. And I think, for example, that you don't have to, there's an awful lot of stuff about wannabes. In fact, about 10 years ago, the Lakota Nation actually signed a declaration of war against wannabes and phony shamans who were expropriating Indian religion for their own purposes and so on. And the Lakota people were just sick and tired of that, so they wrote a declaration of war. But even though I'm sure their tongues were in their cheeks, there's something to be said for that no non-native can fully understand or appreciate what it's like, I suppose, to be a native. And while we might admire and respect certain aspects of native life, we ought not to think, even if we do admire and respect them, that somehow we are thinking the same way, because we're not, and we never really will. And that's what hacked off the Lakota people, a position with which I have a certain amount of empathy. I used to live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which was just chock full of people who were shopping cart theologians, I call them, sort of pick a bit of Buddhism, a bit of native shamanism, a bit of this and a bit of that, and concoct something that seemed to satisfy them. That's fine, but no one ought to make the leap that somehow that qualifies as genuine Native American theology, because it probably doesn't. Nevertheless, to confront all this stuff is really important, and I find it happening all the time, and I find it vastly interesting personally to observe and think about.
You certainly indicated that the great contributions have been made by many Native Americans. It's very, very significant, and they're very, very special people. And one of the things that I appreciate so much about my friends that are Native American is their spirituality, and you've referred some to that. But in this series we're comparing Canada and the United States on all these different subjects. And as you have studied the history both in Canada and the United States, are there great similarities between the spiritual aspects? I'll put it this way. Native Americans have such a great appreciation of nature, and they have such respect for the earth. And a great friend of mine once said to me concerning the spirituality, said, some of that is so private we don't share it beyond our community. So would you tell us if there is a general theme that runs through Native Americans, both in Canada and the United States?
Well, far be it for me to speak with any authority about Native faith, but I think a few general statements might be safe to make. I think the fundamental idea is that because of the nature of Native faith, it never became episcopal, hierarchical, liturgical, or anything else. And so it really remained centered as a 24/7 type of deal. I'm not suggesting, don't get me wrong, that Christians are Christians on Sunday and heathens the rest of the week. It's not that, but rather that for Native people, the faith was omnipresent and omniscient and everywhere all the time. And I think that really does kind of tune people into a different sense of reality. Many people who write about Native faiths, talk about the four corners and circularity instead of linearism and so on and so forth. And of course, in the immensity of North America, there's practically an immensity of varying views, but there are some sort of the fundamental unifying theme is that the Native faiths tended to be polytheistic, tend to be naturalistic, tend to be animistic. Why is that good? It's good because it does tie people into a direct, everyday, responsible connection with the world. In other words, as Calvin Martin wrote many years ago, that Indians used to, and was nothing new really, but Indians used to thank the animals that they killed, because if they didn't do that, the animals might disappear. So there's this real connectivity that's going on, that they never really divorced themselves from the fundamental principles of their theology. It didn't become an intellectual exercise.
It's an integrated process.
Yeah. Now then, from that idea, you can get these sort of misapprehensions. Here's a great example, I think. Hippies, for example, thought that Indians are natural people. That's really good. I'm a natural person, therefore I'm like an Indian. Indians were the first and the best natural environmentalists. They would never do anything wrong to wreck the environment. Well, that's not true. There's plenty of archaeological evidence that Indians killed too many bison here and there, or cut too many trees here and there, and caused environmental degradation and paid serious consequences for that act, or those acts. I'm not trying to claim that Indians don't have any ecological sense, but I am saying that this is a typically, what would be the right word, I guess for want of better words, you'd call it a liberal attitude that Indians are good and therefore we'll take from them what we think is good because it serves our purposes. Many Indians do not. These things intersect at certain points but not uniformly. So Native people will accept environmentalists on their side for certain purposes, but then in the case, for example, the Maco whaling controversy that's going on right now, you have the environmentalists and the Native people on opposite poles, and usually the environmentalists express some chagrin and horror at this, thinking, well, Indians are supposed to be like us, but indeed Indians had their own point of view, and it didn't necessarily square with what the Sea Shepherds or the Greenpeacers wanted. So it's a very interesting set of ideas, I think, and it's a continuing conversation that goes on.
Thank you. Erna Reinhardt.
I want to shift gears a little bit, and you've already kind of started that, Barton. I want to talk a little bit about current issues, and are there some issues amongst the Native Americans in Canada and the United States where they are collaborating to work on maybe some issues together?
Most definitely, and I think that's one of the great advances that Native people in North America have made in the last 30 or 40 years. And to get into the explanation of why that happened, one would have to go back to the New Deal and the Indian Reorganization Act and all that stuff, which is this lengthy list of federal legislation and Canadian legislation that begins roughly at the same time. The net result of all this was to yield a greater degree of self-determination. The 20th century, at least after 1930, has been about self-determination for Native people. Now, in the Southwest, CERT, the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, was a cartel, a sort of energy, gas, and oil cartel that was put together about 30 or so years ago. It was, to my knowledge, the first or one of the very first such organizations. Because different tribes with common resource interests realize that in unity there is strength. Now, out of that comes a variety of other things. I think there's a couple of cases that are real critically important lately. One is Pacific Coast nations' interest in whaling and other maritime activities. And then, of course, this very big issue in the U.S. About Indian gaming. In some cases, these are consortia working together. In other cases, it's one nation going it alone, and then others learn from their lessons and experiences and so on and so forth. But the Makah Nation in the Olympic Peninsula wound up hunting whales a few years ago. It was a restoration of a treaty right, guaranteed. There was a great deal of resistance about it. Once that happened, however, and I may be able to talk more about that later tonight, but once the event actually took place, it seems to have inspired some British Columbian Native nations to resuscitate their cultural program of whaling. Folks, including environmentalists and whale lovers and so on, who do not like this, bring out a variety of arguments against it.
I'm sorry to interrupt on that note. The clock always wins, as we say on this program. We're out of time. It went so fast, and we thank you so much. It was most informative. Yes, it goes so fast, and we appreciate your being with us. And ladies and gentlemen, we have been interviewing Dr. Barton Barber, who is an assistant professor of history at Boise State University, and dealing with First Nations and newcomers in our series on celebrating Canadian-American friendship. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, when we are going to continue this series. And on each of these programs, we are moving into another issue or another area about our friends to the north, Canada, and how we relate to them here. Until next week, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.